afternoon. I would like to give this brief analysis of Nagorno-Karabakh and the situation there, and I will answer 4 different questions. Where is Nagorno-Karabakh? What is its history? What is happening there? And why does this matter? So, on the first issue, Nagorno-Karabakh is a small enclave, roughly around the size of the state of Delaware, in the South Caucasus. And historically, it was an Armenian territory. In fact, Armenians are the indigenous people of Nagorno-Karabakh. It has been inhabited at various times by other peoples, such as the Persians and the Azeris, but they were very much latecomers compared to the Armenians. And the Armenian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh goes back to the 8th century BC. So, how do we know this? First of all, there are historical records that talk about this territory being inhabited by Armenians. Herodotus, for example, the ancient Greek historian, is one such source. There are also architectural remains. I think most importantly, the monastic complex at Zanzazar, but also other monuments that talk about a continuous Armenian presence going back millennia in time. So there is a competition historically between the Armenians and the Azeris making claims about who has the right to this territory, and history is a part of that. However, the Azeris have fabricated an entirely false history led by a member of their Academy of Sciences, Zia Bunyatev, who created a school of Azeri historiography regarding Nagorno-Karabakh. But the historical record, both the written record and the architectural record, tells a very different story. And the story it tells is that the Armenians are the indigenous people in this territory. The Armenian name for Nagorno-Karabakh is, of course, Artsakh. And I should also say something about the title that is used in the mass media, which is Nagorno-Karabakh, or Mountainous Karabakh. Nagorno is the Russian word for mountainous, and it refers to the fact that Karabakh can be divided into 2 sections. One is the mountainous section to the west, bordering on Armenia, and then gradually those mountains change into plains and go into the flatlands that make up Azerbaijan all the way down to the Caspian coast. So there is a part of Karabakh, Lower Karabakh, that is not contested between the Armenians and the Azeris. It is the mountainous part that we are talking about here. In the early 1920s, actually during the First Republic, there was fighting in this territory, as there was in Armenia proper, over control of Nagorno-Karabakh. And this was resolved by the Bolsheviks, especially through the actions of Joseph Stalin, later the dictator of the Soviet Union, but at that time the Commissar of Nationalities. And despite the fact that in 1920, around 95% of the population of Nagorno-Karabakh was Armenian, he assigned this territory to Azerbaijan and declared it an oblast in Azerbaijan. and that means a province, a section of Azerbaijan. The Azeris were happy to get the territory, but they were not happy about the fact that Karabakh had an official designation and status as a province within Azerbaijan. They very much would have preferred to absorb it completely without any kind of designation. And as I said, the population at that time was 90 to 95% Armenian. The Armenians were very unhappy about this decision, both in Karabakh and in Armenia, and they were at various times, especially in the 20s and 30s, until this was repressed, that there were some protests, some leafleting, and undercurrents of unhappiness that sometimes became public. What were Stalin's motivations in carrying this out? Well, I think there were probably two. One was that in making assignments of different territories to different republics, the Bolsheviks had an eye to sowing the seeds for later discord that they thought that they could control. Eventually it turned out that they couldn't. But the idea was that if they could do things that demographically were illogical and didn't make sense, they could have Armenians and Azeris fighting and being unhappy with one another, and this would prevent them from putting their differences aside and uniting against the center. So it was a way of controlling minority populations that the Bolsheviks viewed as potentially troublesome. Probably the more important motivation was that the early Bolsheviks thought that the Muslim regions to the south, Turkey and the Arab territories and Persia, were prime real estate that could be converted to Bolshevism through organizing and various kinds of espionage activities and whatnot. And they wanted to curry favor with Turkey, and thought that if Nagorno-Karabakh went to Azerbaijan, they would win favor in Turkey and could receive benefits in the short and long term. The Turks, of course, totally disappointed them, but I think that was part of Stalin's agenda. An interesting part of Stalin's activities is that Stalin is reviled in the West. There's little that's ever said or written about him that is positive, and you would think that something that he was responsible for, such as placing Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, wouldn't be taken very seriously. But in fact, it's taken very seriously. His name is left out of the discussion, and the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh went to Azerbaijan is taken as the starting point for any discussion about this territory. In other words, there's no discussion of how it got to Azerbaijan. It just was part of Azerbaijan from 1920 until the early 1990s, and therefore there's an issue of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. But in my view, there's no issue of territorial integrity of Azerbaijan because the assignment from the beginning was illegitimate. So often in the public press and media, there's talk about the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan versus the self-determination of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. And you even find in some accounts this notion that territorial integrity has greater force in international law than self-determination, but that's absolutely not true. If you read the legal documents on this, the law says that they have equal strength. And these are some ways in which the Armenian claims, both in political discussions and in media accounts, are weakened, are undermined. But I think the Armenian case very strong. What about Azeri policies in Nagorno-Karabakh? What did they actually do once they got a hold of the territory? Well, there were no genocidal actions that were carried out against Armenians that I know of, but what there were different efforts that would discourage Armenians from staying there. Various forms of discrimination in the educational system, for example, running schools without teaching the Armenian language or Armenian history, discouraging people from speaking Armenian in government offices and things of that sort. And also the settlement of Azeris into Nagorno-Karabakh to change the demographics of the territory, to reduce the percentage of Armenians from 90 to 95% to something less than that. And when I taught at Yerevan State University in the 80s, I had a couple of students from Nagorno-Karabakh, and they would tell me that whenever Armenians would complain about situations there, they would be told, well, you have your own territory. You have Armenia. You're free to move there. You don't have to stay here. And this was a part of a policy of emptying Karabakh of Armenians to the degree possible. And indeed, by the mid-1980s, the 90 to 95% Armenian majority had dwindled to about 75%. And Armenians felt that this was something close to the tipping point, that if it went much lower than that, then Armenians would simply leave in droves, and the territory would become, as Nakhichevan, another contested territory that went to Azerbaijan, there would be practically eventually no Armenians left. So this brings us now to the Gorbachev era, and Gorbachev was the last ruler of the Soviet Union, and he introduced policies of glasnost and perestroika. And glasnost called for greater openness in public life in the Soviet Union, and sort of eliminating all these taboo topics that couldn't be talked about in public without undertaking considerable risk to one's freedom, that these topics would now be opened up. And the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh and also in Armenia saw this as an opportunity for them to raise this issue, which they did in 1988. And 1988 was a kind of loni for, in which all the rules were thrown out, and you had mass demonstrations both in Karabakh and in Yerevan that were sustained, that went on over the course of months. And this also was the same year in which there was a massive earthquake in Leninagan, now called by its original name Gyumri, Armenia's second largest city. And the Soviet Union did a very poor job coming to the rescue of the survivors of that earthquake and in providing shelter and other amenities to the survivors. And that poor response further discredited the Soviet Union in the eyes of Armenians, and that's when you got the creation of the so-called Karabagh Committee of people who were primarily intellectuals, but dissidents and people unhappy with Soviet rule in Armenia and Karabakh. And Levon Chorbajian, the first president of the Armenian Republic, emerged as the leader of that committee. So these demonstrations went on for sustained periods of time. And eventually what happened was that the Azeris carry out a massacre of Armenians in their industrial city of Sumgait, north of Baku. Several dozen Armenians were brutally murdered. That's all documented in my book, Armenia in Crisis, that was published in the mid-1990s. That talks about what happened at Sumgait. And the Zoryan Institute also has a book that documents what went on there as well. Eventually the two territories, now independent countries, went to war between 1991 and the ceasefire that was negotiated under Russian auspices in 1994. And as a result of that war, Armenians gained control of Nagorno-Karabakh and several Azeri provinces in western Azerbaijan surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. And since that time, which is a long time, we're talking now about 20 years, Karabakh has had de facto independence and control of its territory. It runs its affairs, but it has no international recognition from anybody. So it's a kind of a renegade state. And there have been many attempts to negotiate a permanent peace settlement, primarily through OSCE, or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. These efforts have not been successful. What you've had since the mid-90s is a ceasefire without any kind of permanent settlement. However, for the most part, that ceasefire is held. So what started a few days ago is the most serious violation of the ceasefire. There have been people killed by snipers. There have been rocket attacks and things of that sort, but nothing on the scale of what's recently happened. There is right now a very tentative ceasefire in effect. However, it's not sponsored by anybody. It's not backed up by any government or influential NGO, and it could flare and expand into another war, a large-scale war, at any time. That potential is definitely there. I don't think that we're out of the woods on this at all. And even if we go back to the status quo ante, what we're going to have is a ceasefire that more or less holds without a permanent treaty settlement of any of these issues. In the worst case scenario, which I think and hope is unlikely, this could develop into a full-scale war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it could involve Russia and Turkey, who are on bad terms right now to begin with. So you could have an expansion